first of all, thank you very much for being here and welcome to this event about environmental security. Thank you for coming on such a sunny, nice summer day to spend your morning here with us. And my name is Hakala. I'm a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And yeah, so I will be the sort of moderator. I will introduce the speakers and so on. Today we will talk about environmental security for mainly, I guess, two reasons. The first one is that we are very happy to welcome Professor Selby from the University of Sussex here as a main speaker today. And he's a very sort of foremost expert on environmental security and climate security and climate geopolitics and so on. So we will be, or at least I'm very excited to hear what he will share with us today. And then the other reason that we are here today is that this is the final seminar of a workshop project that we have had at FIIA, and that we have been organizing in cooperation with the BIOS Research Unit and the Finnish Meteorological Institute and the University of Helsinki. And we have been very happy to be funded by the Niina and Atte Foundation. And so the idea today is also to present sort of the outcomes of these workshop discussions of that project. And maybe I will just get actually started with that because I don't have much time for my own own presentation here, and I have a lot that I would hope to say. So maybe we can, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so the idea behind this project was that me with some of my colleagues have been sort of noticing in the Finnish discussion, in the Finnish policy discussion, and also maybe to some extent in terms of research, that there is actually quite little consideration of environmental change as a security issue or as a more of a sort of geopolitical foreign policy issue in Finland. And this is kind of different even from some of our neighbors, like for example, Sweden has been very active in the international sort of front on the issue of especially climate security. And of course, we didn't want to be any worse than Sweden, but also because me and some of my researcher colleagues, and also some of the people that I spoke to in different ministries, for example, started to feel that there's a need for a better understanding of the security and foreign policy impacts of climate change and environmental change in general. So we put together this project, which had as its sort of main objectives to, well, first of all, to through these sort of interactive discussions between different stakeholders to start to recognize the impacts of global environmental change in foreign and security policy, especially from the point of view of Finland, which was, in our view, kind of missing. And then maybe a more sort of ambitious objective of the project was to start to identify some potential ways to address environmental security in policymaking. And then also just we felt like there was a need for this very basic kind of bringing together stakeholders, as I said, from different institutes, from the academia, but also from the policymaking world and from the sort of practitioner world and also from the civil society, because we felt like there is a lot of information that is sort of held by all of these different actors, but it's not being shared. And one of the, it seemed at least to us that one of the kind of main needs that there is in terms of addressing environmental security is that it's a very sort of multidisciplinary issue and multi-sectoral issue. So there is this need for multi-sectoral understanding in that sense. And then also we just wanted to kind of encourage discussion about environmental security in Finland in general in order to have the discussion started. So it's maybe, I can't really say that these are necessarily, I mean, these were maybe the sort of findings of the project, but also kind of in a way some of the starting points of the discussions. Because when we got started, obviously one of the main maybe problems was about defining what environmental security actually is. And I'm sure that there are many participants here today who are not necessarily very familiar with the term. So it's also maybe good in that sense to kind of have a general understanding about what I mean when I speak about environmental security. So in a general sense, you can say that it's about sort of studying or understanding the impacts of environmental change on the society and specifically the sort of threats posed by environmental change on the society. But obviously that is a very broad definition and it includes many different aspects. So we wanted to have some kind of a way of sort of better I guess understanding and addressing and sort of compartmentalizing also the issues that go into environmental security. And I will, there are many different ways of kind of categorizing these different sort of impacts. And this one that we kind of came up with in the project discussions is only maybe one way of looking at it and one approach. But of course, also the important thing to understand is that more or less these different approaches are still dealing with the same issues. So they are kind of like trying to understand the security impacts of environmental change. But we in this project kind of categorized environmental threats into the 3 different levels, I would say, which you can hear. So you can see here. So we have the local impacts and the geopolitical impacts and the structural impacts, and I will explain them in a bit more detail, but still very fastly and efficiently now. So first of all, there are the local impacts, which are maybe the most kind of simple in a way to understand, and the ones that people usually think about when you talk about the security impacts of environmental change. So we are talking about extreme weather events and things like flooding, or then these more sort of permanent impacts like sea level rise, or these abrupt changes in the ecosystems and so on. And the important thing here is to understand that these impacts influence, of course, the entire ecosystem, but also the society in many ways, and they can have very disruptive impacts, for example, on energy systems or on water management and things like that, which have sometimes very severe impacts on the society and on people and on people's well-being. But what we also more or less determined is that in Finland there actually is quite a lot of work done and a kind of an understanding about the kind of local impacts that are facing Finland. And there is a lot of this sort of work done by authorities also across sectors on these issues. So of course you can always do better in a way, but the local impacts are actually quite, or to an extent they are addressed in Finland. But then there are the maybe more complicated impacts. First of all, the geopolitical ones. And here the main issue is maybe that the ecological impacts are combined with these societal but also political and geopolitical factors. So here we are talking about these, I guess, events and phenomena which occur when politics get involved in a way, but that are still caused originally by different changes of the environment. So, for example, conflicts that are somehow encouraged or induced by environmental change or forced migration, also the growth of global inequality and disruptions in resource flows, like, for example, in energy flows and transportations and so on. And then in a more maybe broad and very geopolitical sense, the kind of changing power relations that happen when, for example, the sort of possibilities of different countries to produce certain resources change. And at least in Finland, these are maybe not very clearly recognized, and also in terms of research in general, we're not very familiar with the geopolitical impacts, and especially with sort of understanding the extent of environmental change that is expected to occur, and how and in sort of to what extent it will actually affect geopolitics and sort of power relations and so on. So there seems to be a lot of work to be done here. And then we have the structural impacts, by which I refer to the impacts that occur when we are in fact mitigating or sort of preventing and adapting to environmental change. And of course, this by no means am I saying that these mitigation or prevention activities should not be undertaken, but in fact they very urgently need to be done. But the idea is that they are, because of the extent to which the environment is changing, the prevention and the adaptation needs to be done in such a sort of severe level in a way that it will very strongly also affect the societies and politics and so on. So here we are talking about the sort of very basis of our economic production, which potentially needs to change or shift from this sort of growth emphasizing perspective to a more sustainable model, or the energy transition, which will, if we or when we have to give up fossil fuel-based energy production, that will considerably, again, affect societies and also the relations between different countries. And then also how we can govern this change in a democratic way without kind of resorting to these sort of exceptional or forceful measures, and to sort of maintain these open and democratic societies while still having sort of strong enough climate or sort of environmental actions. So this also, in a way, affects the security of our societies. So here we have, for those people who understand things better sort of visually, of which I'm unfortunately not one of those, but this is a kind of a visualization of the sort of different levels. So we have the local, regional, and global level, and then these short-term and long-term impacts, and or sort of levels, I guess, and then the different local and geopolitical and structural impacts kind of work at different levels here, but also to some extent they cross-sect and are occurring simultaneously. So briefly then the outcomes, I guess, of the project, which you can, by the way, also see in a policy paper that we have produced, which has been circulated, or you are free to take it in paper form, in print, here outside the hall, but also it will be on on the website of the BIOS research unit, so you can look at it. It's unfortunately at the moment it's only in Finnish, but we will probably make some kind of a briefing paper out of it in English. But to summarize the main outcomes of the project, in our view, we found that for Finland, these geopolitical and structural impacts are actually sort of relatively more significant than the direct ones. Obviously, Finland's a country which is rather safe from many sort of these, the worst kinds of environmental impacts, like these very severe storms and things like that. But on the other hand, we can't imagine that the kind of change that is taking place globally around us and in politics and in economics and so on, that wouldn't influence us in many ways. And the problem is that we are at the moment insufficiently recognizing and addressing these problems in our policy making, and also I should add maybe in research, so we need to improve on that. And then we argue that Finland will need to further integrate environmental security into its policies, both at the national level, but also at the international level, where a lot of these important decisions are made. And here it's important, of course, to stress also that this is not only an issue for security policy as such, so we can't leave environmental issues only to the security sector, and I'm sure that the security sector wouldn't want to have responsibility of that either, but we need to work cross-sectorally and in kind of cooperation between different actors from different ministries and sectors and so on. So what we need is this kind of cross-sectoral networking and coordination, and also increasingly sort of scenario building and activities that will improve our understanding of these problems. And what I would also argue is that we need more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research to support decision-making on these issues. And actually, on that note, as a final note, I'm happy to add that I was asked by a representative of the Finnish Academy to inform you, especially those of you who are researchers here, that there will be a call for research funding by Nordforsk, which is this Nordic financing model for research, specifically on the environmental security issue. So hopefully we will be able to use that to address some of the kind of missing points that we have in research still. But I think I will end here because I've already kind of overused my time. And I guess we will just go immediately to our main speaker, and then we will have a discussion afterwards, and you can, if you have questions also about the project or comments or criticisms, you can also point them out then. And here, by the way, is the link to the BIOS website where you can find the policy paper. Okay, but then Professor Jan Selby, he's a professor of international relations from the University of Sussex. And his focus is about political ecology and environmental security. He has been writing, for example, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and about water and power issues and politics in the region. And for me, at least, he is a very important scholar on environmental security, and so that's why I'm very excited to hear what you have to say today. So, welcome.
Great, thank you very much. Let me push this up a little bit. I've sorted. This is very fancy. Thank you ever so much, Emma. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming, and to our panelists. I feel honoured to have a panel after my words. I look forward to our discussion. Thanks also for giving me the opportunity to visit Helsinki, Emma, especially during midsummer, even though that meant I didn't sleep last night. I'm not used to midsummer so far north, and for giving me the opportunity to be here at a moment and shortly after you have a new government, which is, of course, promising to take such important steps in relation to climate change. I must also say it's always a relief to leave Britain at the moment, so thank you very much for that as well. I haven't asked anybody yet whether it's possible, given your new government, to apply for asylum on grounds of Brexit. If anybody knows about that, please let me know. Before I get going, let me just say a couple of things about by way of introduction. One is I'm going to talk about climate security specifically rather than environmental security and more broadly. I'd be happy in the discussion to talk on some broader issues, and some of that broader issues of environmental security inform sort of in the background of what I'm going to say. That's one thing I want to say. A second thing by way of introduction is a couple of my slides are stolen from Halvard Buhaug, with his permission, I should add, at PRIO, Peace Research Institute of Oslo. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then the final thing I wanted to say is quite a lot of what I'm going to say draws upon things that I've written. My publications can all be found on my personal website, which is listed at the bottom there if anybody wants to follow up on any of these themes. Now, this graph shows the increase in atmospheric carbon since 1700. Now, what stands out straight away is the exponential curve, meaning that atmospheric CO2 is not just still rising, but is still rising at an ever-accelerating rate. In the 1960s, atmospheric carbon dioxide was rising at below 0.8 parts per million annually. By the 1990s, the growth rate had become 1.5 parts per million. By contrast, last month, the average carbon dioxide concentration as recorded at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii was over 3.5 parts per million higher than during the previous year. We can't know for sure whether this trend will continue, whether this trend of increase will continue, and we do not know exactly how it will translate into temperature rises, into warming. But given the trajectory that we are on, it is, in my view, almost inevitable that average global warming will exceed 2 degrees C. To my eyes, at least, the planet is currently online for somewhere between the IPCC's mid-range scenario. This is the basic IPCC scenarios that they work with. It's currently online for somewhere between the mid-range scenario, indicated by the black line here, and its high-end scenario, which is in technical language called RCP 8.5, which imagines that by 2100, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels will have risen to 936 parts per million, and that global temperatures will have risen by up to 4.8 degrees centigrade. Now, this latter scenario is unlikely for a range of reasons, but it remains, in my view, plausible. Climatic changes of this magnitude will inevitably have profound societal and humanitarian consequences. Now, this graphic shows projected maximum wet bulb temperatures. Wet bulb temperature is a measure of temperature plus humidity. It shows them for South Asia. Now, a wet bulb temperature of over 35 degrees C, which is the deep red in this graphic, is fatal within hours, even for a healthy body. The left-hand map here, so where are we? Right over here, shows the historical pattern of maximum wet bulb temperature events. The middle one with 2 degrees C of global warming, and this one here at 4.5 degrees centigrade global warming. And so what this right-hand map suggests is that under a 4.5 degree warming scenario, most of South Asia would periodically experience weather events at or approaching 35 degrees wet bulb temperature, with mass casualties for those outside, the inevitable result. The current heat wave across northern India is perhaps a foretaste of this. But what about climate change's conflict and security implications? What can be said with any certainty about these? Now, my short, honest answer would be not that much with great certainty, because conflict is incredibly resistant to prediction. This slide, this is the most famous work of 20th century international relations, The Theory of International Politics by Kenneth Waltz, which was published in 1979. And he doesn't do much prediction in the book, but this is the sort of closest he gets to it. He asks, who is likely to be around 100 years from now? The United States, the Soviet Union, France, Egypt, Thailand, and Uganda? Or Ford, IBM, Shell, Unilever, and Massey Ferguson? And his answer? I would bet on the States, perhaps even Uganda, just 10 or so years before the Soviet Union started to collapse. Now, Waltz is not alone in his poor predictive record. My discipline, international relations, the whole discipline, failed to predict the end of the Cold War. We failed to predict the Arab Spring. And in relation to climate change, to anthropogenic climate change, there are particular problems. There is a particular problem. Well, there are particular problems. The sort of transdisciplinarity is clearly a particular problem. The more specific one is that the key problem in prediction in relation to anthropogenic climate change is that there have been no prior historical instances of it. It's a first. So the basic positivist method, you'd make predictions about the future based upon analysis of regularities in the past, doesn't apply in the same way. We can't do that. We can't use such a method straightforwardly with global anthropogenic climate change simply because there have been no prior historical cases of it. Now, what this means is that all claims about the future conflict and security implications of climate change are to some extent imaginative, rooted in acts of imagination. Some of these acts of imagination are typically called scenarios. Scenarios is a fancy word for storylines, really. And others involve analogical reasoning, drawing comparisons from cases where we think there are similarities to what climate change might involve. And this clearly poses a problem. Our imaginations of the future are often, perhaps always, shaped by our understandings of the present, by our present-day preoccupations, by our own political commitments and our views of the world, our individual or collective commitments or views of the world. So at the very least, it seems to me, what we need to do when discussing the future conflict and security implications of climate change is to consider whether the ways they are currently imagined and presented is convincing, or at least plausible, and whether there are other ways that they might be imagined and thought about. That's what I'm going to try and do in this lecture in the next 50 minutes or so. Specifically, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to discuss standard climate security thinking, the standard climate security imaginary, if you like. And I'm going to argue that the way it envisages the likely consequences of climate change is misleading. And secondly, I'm going to suggest the bones of an alternative framework for thinking about how climate change might affect or might be relevant to patterns of conflict and security over the next 50 years or so. And then thirdly, I'm going to consider questions of mitigation in particular, which very much links with what Emma was talking about in relation to structural factors, which I consider to be the most important dimension of this whole problem, and one which is very much under very much underexplored. Let me turn firstly then to the standard narrative of how climate change will affect 21st century patterns of conflict and security. Now, these are all extracts from the most influential policy reports on the subject, all produced out of Washington, D.C. The report pictured on the left, this one up here, and quoted at the top comes from that report, was the first major report on the subject produced for the Pentagon. Its overall emphasis, which has been repeated multiple times, is that climate change will inevitably lead to or contribute to increased resource scarcities, political crises, civil conflicts, and state collapses, especially in the driest and poorest parts of Africa and Asia. I highlight further down the phrase threat multiplier, which was first used in this report, well, actually not that report, that's the 2014 report, in this report here by an outfit called the Center for Naval Analysis Corporation in a 2007 report. And this phrase, threat multiplier, has become the standard piece of policy jargon for understanding the implications of climate change. It's often said that climate change will be a threat multiplier for existing instabilities in some of the most volatile parts of the world. Policymakers have said much the same type of thing. This, for instance, is how the UK, at the top, is how the UK and the US national security strategies from quite a few years ago now represented the issue. And below, Ban Ki-moon and Barack Obama. You don't need to read all of this. You'll get the picture, I think. There's a consistent message here that the impacts of climate change on global security will be profound and will be bad. And they're, of course, imagined in particular ways, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, what's problematic about this? Well, the first thing I want to emphasize is that there really is no academic consensus in support of these emphases, in support of these policy emphases. These are the words of Niels Petter Gleditsch from PRIO, also from PRIO, who Gleditsch is in many ways the doyen of quantitative research on climate security. There is not yet much evidence, he said in a 2012 piece. And that's not just him. This is what the IPCC said in its fifth assessment report in 2014. Collectively, the research does not conclude that there is a strong positive relationship between warming and armed conflict. Confident statements about the effects of future changes in climate on armed conflict are not possible. Lest you might think that that's quite a few years ago. Surely they've got a bit more certain now. This is what the IPCC's report from last year said on the subject. Noting calls for caution, noting inconsistent associations and inconsistent relationships. So certainly not a strong message from the sort of mainstream academic community about what the certainty, confidence about these relationships. And here to give you another excuse me, example is a summary of the views of leading experts on the subject. This appeared last week in the journal Nature. This here is the summary of their views on climate change and climate variability as a risk factor for conflict compared to other factors. And what you see here is that they collectively, this is a collective views of, I think, 11 leading experts they assembled together, is that climate variability and or change came down at number 14 out of 16 factors that they had identified. And it also comes out as the most uncertain, the one of which they are most uncertain about what its impact will be. Now, the article in Nature was called Climate as a Risk Factor for Armed Conflict, but this graphic doesn't give that, I mean, it doesn't say it's not a risk factor, but it certainly doesn't say it's the top risk factor or anywhere close to it. In many ways, this heading is misleading. Let me go into just a little bit more detail about the scientific evidence. There is firstly now a large quantitative literature dedicated to exploring the links between climate change and conflict. This piece is by Marshall Burke and colleagues. It's typical of this type of quantitative research, and this is quite a widely cited piece. It found, let me go back there. It found that, you see that there, it found that warmer years are more associated with conflict deaths in Africa, and on this basis, it projected a 54% increase in armed conflict in Africa by 2030, or 393,000 additional battle deaths. So there are some studies like this which do conclude that climate change has very significant conflict effects and implications. But there are two problems. One is that other studies just disagree. Other studies actually using the same data and using some different methodological assumptions have come to very different findings. There is not even agreement within these quantitative studies on whether dry years or wet years are more associated with conflict, or on whether sudden environmental disasters lead to more conflict or more cooperation, or on whether severe drought is a cause of conflict. That's one problem, the lack of consensus. And then the other is that all of these studies are based on analogies, to come back to my point about imagination and the lack of precedent. They're all based on analogies of some type. And the analogies are questionable. Most of them, like this Burke one, are essentially about linkages between the weather and conflict, trying to see if there are correlations between the weather and conflict, and extrapolating from that and trying to draw conclusions about climate change and conflict. But weather and conflict, the relationship between them is arguably rather different than between climate change. Short-term weather fluctuation brings in questions to do with military tactics, for instance, that don't apply in the same way to climate change. The only studies that don't do that are ones that, a group of studies which look at pre-industrial long-term trends in climate and their links to political crises and conflict. But this method is even more problematic in analogical sort of terms. Even the IPCC has recognized this. It says, the IPCC said in 2014, findings from historical antecedents are not directly transferable to the contemporary globalized world. Now, other evidence, that's the quantitative research, then there's other evidence which comes from particular cases. The most notable of these being the Syrian civil war and the Boko Haram crisis around Lake Chad. In both of these cases, environmental impacts have been very widely identified as important drivers of economic crisis and in turn of violent conflict and mass displacement. But in both cases, the supporting evidence is very, very, very thin. This graph, let me turn to Syria. This graph illustrates the basic claim made by those who think that climate change was a factor in sparking the Syrian civil war. That, starting at the top, the global anthropogenic climate change, long-term drying trends was a key factor in an exceptionally severe drought in northeast Syria, in the broader Fertile Crescent region and northeast Syria specifically, for 3 years, 2006-7 to 8-9. That this led to drought-induced outmigration of up to 1.5 million, and that the social pressures in receiving areas was one of the factors which sparked the civil war. Now, I've looked at this case in some detail, and I've got to say that it's pretty much without basis. A plausible case can be made for the first bit here. A very plausible case can be made for that. There's some methodological questions, but a plausible case can be made there. On the second step, the second arrow, well, there are a number of problems. There's no evidence that anywhere close to 1.5 million people were displaced during this drought period. The UN and the Syrian government said 40 to 60,000 families, not 1.5 million people. There was extensive outmigration taking place from this region even before the drought, which is the sort of thing that's often missed when people identify a drought as a driver of migration and conflict. And the most important trigger of outmigration during this period, I came to the conclusion in my work, was probably not the drought itself, but a sudden cut in agricultural input subsidies, especially cuts in diesel subsidies, which had huge implications. That's the second step, the second arrow. And then the third step, well, there's frankly no evidence at all, I came to the conclusion. Not just me, with a number of authors. I published a piece in Political Geography on this that came out in 2017, and we concluded that there is no good evidence to conclude that global climate change-related drought in Syria was a contributory causal factor in the country's civil war. Now, as for Lake Chad, here the case for linking climate change and conflict is even weaker. It's repeatedly been claimed with the aid of graphics like these. If you have a look at these ones up here, that Lake Chad is vanishing. That this has fueled increased competition for natural resources and exacerbated poverty, and that this was a key factor in the rise of Boko Haram and the consequent displacement now of around 2.5 million people into the surrounding states. It's a set of claims that has been very widely promoted, but even many of those who have promoted it, like Adelphi, for instance, now acknowledge that Lake Chad isn't shrinking. This is what Adelphi say. This is Adelphi's recent report on Lake Chad. And they say it's not a shrinking lake, but a fluctuating one. This is their graph of what's happening in terms of water levels in Lake Chad, and the green is basically what's happening. It's pretty stable, but just fluctuating seasonally. In fact, if anything, if you include groundwater, it's growing. Adelphi continue to insist in this report that the Lake Chad region is caught in a conflict trap and that climate change is compounding the region's challenges. But really they offer no evidence for this, and my assumption, frankly, is that they have to say something like this because their whole funding stream for this work comes from work on climate flood fragility. Now, beyond these questions of evidence, there are also some theoretical problems with mainstream climate crisis and security narratives. I want to highlight just three. First, there has, in recent decades, been remarkable progress on a list of global social indicators. And while climate change might well affect these positive trends, it seems unlikely that it will reverse them altogether. There has, for instance, been remarkable progress in global health. You don't need to look at all the details of this. There's been decline in disaster deaths, despite a steep rise in the frequency of disaster events. And food production continues to rise. This table here illustrates, I think, the issue very well. This is analysis of agriculture in Africa, including potential climate change impacts. Now, on the face of it, this table suggests that climate change is going to result in a 5.1% drop in cereal production. But the analysis also says that without climate change, cereal production is projected to rise by 108%. I'm not saying you have to believe these figures, but there's a very different storyline clearly at stake here. Is what's going to happen by 2050 103% increase in African seal production or a 5% decrease? You can tell a very different story here. Oh, I'll come to Kautsky in a moment. Now, that's one issue. We need to bear in mind some of these positive trends. That's not to say they'll definitely continue, but that's sort of often forgotten when we talk about climate security sort of disaster narratives. Now, a second concern, I think, is that climate crisis narratives often operate with a quite anachronistic understanding of rural livelihoods. They typically imagine that the rural poor are uniquely vulnerable to the weather, but they're not. So here's Karl Kautsky for you from his book, The Agrarian Question, in 1999. Let me just read this out to you. He's commenting on talking about agricultural livelihoods within the context of capitalism and what capitalism does for the meaning of agricultural rural livelihoods. The peasant was now dependent on the market, which proved to be even more moody and unpredictable than the weather. At least the weather's perfidiousness could be prepared for. Ditches could mitigate the effects of a particularly wet summer, and irrigation could counter the consequences of a drought. Smoking fires could protect vines from spring frost and so on. But the peasant had no means of arresting a collapse in prices or of selling unsaleable corn. What was once a blessing, a good harvest, became a curse. That being because a good harvest can often lead to overproduction and a collapse in prices. Now, if this was true 120 years ago, it's clearly much more the case now. A poor smallholder in contemporary Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is vulnerable, yes, to poor rains, of course, but also to sudden changes in global commodity prices, to sudden changes in the availability of fuel or fertilizers, or to government input subsidies, to changes in the volume of remittances received from family members working in the global north, and so on. Global climate change will no doubt create new stresses and hence deep uncertainties and vulnerabilities for the world's rural poor. But within globalized capitalism, the biggest causes of vulnerability are economic, social, and political, not, I would argue, local, environmental. Third broader issue. I think we need to recognize that most resource conflicts are not fundamentally about scarcity. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail about this for reasons of time, except to say that the idea that scarcity is the driver of resource conflicts is like one of the founding assumptions of climate security talk. Climate change will worsen scarcities, just as population growth was imagined to do so in the past, and that will drive further competition and, in turn, conflict. But if scarcity isn't at the root of resource crises, this model doesn't really fully apply, or we need to be cautious about it at least. And I think there are all kinds of problems with this model, what I would call a Malthusian model. That resource conflicts are always fundamentally about unequal distribution, access, and control, and not necessarily about scarcity. One can get resource conflicts in areas of abundance. Arguably, they're more associated with that than with scarcity. And arguably, questions of the economic value of resources are more important than the scarcity or abundance of those resources per se. I can go into more detail about that in discussion if necessary. The final thing I want to say about on this, by way of sort of critical comment on climate security narratives, is that much of what that is said about climate change and security is frankly motivated by interest in exaggerating the links. The Indian journalist Palagumi Salnath observed he has a terrific book titled "Everybody Loves a Good Drought." And what he meant by that, and what he shows, is that drought provide an opportunity for elites to blame nature and, frankly, in India, rob the poor. By the same token, climate change today is often a convenient excuse for governments and elites who want to deflect attention away from their own culpability or mismanagement, and who want to blame something else instead. This is what happened in Syria. This is what the report from the International Crisis Group, someone speaking to the International Crisis Group. And they said, I won't read all of this out, but the drought, they said, is a convenient excuse. There were long-term mismanagement problems basically caused by government policy. And yet, the regime continues to bring diplomats to the northeast and tell them that the crisis there is all being caused by global warming. Now, what I would add to this is that other actors, informed by these diplomats that went to the northeast and had been told that it was about global warming, then ended up reproducing the same narrative. International organizations, UN organizations, international donors working in Syria blamed climate change for the northeast problems in their reports, partly because they didn't want to piss off the Assad regime, because they worried the Assad regime would throw them out, and partly because they wanted to sort of project the idea that we believe we're taking climate change seriously. The Western media then reproduced the same narrative. Drought stories figure quite well in sort of perfect for nice sensationalist stories. And then climate action campaigners took it up as an illustration, as a supposed illustration of the likely impacts of climate change. So what we basically had was a false narrative started by the Assad regime as a way of deflecting responsibility for a crisis of its own making that ended up being reproduced by the UN, then by the Western media, then in leading academic journals, and right the way up to Barack Obama. Let me go on to give you a different way of thinking about links between climate change and security. I want to suggest to you that climate change has implications for conflict and security along at least 6 dimensions. Impacts, adaptation, opportunity, mitigation, and in the middle here I have identity and discourse. Let me say something very briefly about each of them we can unpack during discussion. Impact I'm not going to say more about. That's effectively what I've been talking about till now. I just want to add to what I've said and to say that nothing in what I've said is meant to imply that climate change will have no conflict and security impacts through the environmental impacts it's had. I'm not saying no impacts at all. Of course it will. But in my view, and for some of the reasons I've already set out, these impacts will probably be less severe than is often claimed, less severe or less straightforward. Secondly, adaptation, which on the one hand is a big part of the reason why climatic impact on conflict will be less severe than is claimed, because of our abilities, human society's abilities to adapt to the changing environment. But on the other hand also has its own conflict and security implications, especially when in the form of large-scale projects. This especially applies to land grabbing. Something's got slightly wrong with the slide there. Which is now a widespread feature of life in the global south, pursued in part because of fears about climate change and its potential impacts on agricultural production. And it applies to dam building, which is at once an adaptation and a mitigation strategy. This is a picture of the Merovi Dam in Sudan, the reservoir behind which submerged 900 villages, displaced 50 to 60,000 people, and involved violent evictions, forced resettlement, and killings by Sudanese security forces. And this was partly justified as a climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. Why is this important? Because we are now, as Christopher Snedden says in his book Conflict Resolution, we are entering a new era of damming the planet's rivers. After a period following the 1990s where major dam building halted, where there were all kinds of worries about the impacts it was having on societies, this is being reversed, partly within the context of worries about climate change. Third, and I don't want to say too much about this, we need to recognize that climate change will not only create risks, which we'll need adapting to, it's also going to create various opportunities, especially at northern latitudes and in the Arctic. Frontier zones which will be opened up by climate change. Land in Russia and Canada in particular is going to be opened up for agriculture. The Arctic is going to be opened up as a trade route. It is also, of course, well on its way to being opened up for mineral and fossil fuel development. And it's also, as you'll know, being steadily militarized. Now, I'm frankly unsure on what the implications of this are likely to be, and I'm sure many people here will know much more about this than me. I look forward to hearing your views on it, but my sense is that the implications of this will be profound. Then fourth, at the bottom of there is mitigation, and I'll come to that. I'll come to that in a moment. But let me come to these middle two factors that I think we need to think about. One of them, and one that I think will loom large in 20th century as the 20th century unfolds, is climate-related conflicts over identity. Now, identity rarely figures in discussions of climate security. But at the same time, we know that most violent conflict is about or in defense of identities or imagined identities, whether these be of religion, of nation, of race, of gender, of class, or whatever. We also know that climate and beliefs and attitudes around climate are increasingly important markers of identity. Climate change isn't just a technical issue or a physical issue. In the US, climate change is now more politically polarizing than abortion. Attitude towards it are deeply divided along lines of race, gender, education, and party. And climate change has become a carrier of all sorts of identity-related antipathies, obsessions, and agendas, probably more than any other issue. Recently, you may have seen a US Department of Energy spokesman called US oil and gas exports molecules of freedom. The commitment to fossil fuels isn't simply about economic growth, but about certain conceptions of freedom and identity as well. In a world that combines climate crisis and resurgent conservative populism, I think these identity issues and splits can only deepen. I don't think that's specific or unique to the US. And I would not discount the possibility that these may have serious conflict, including potentially violent conflict consequences. Lastly, on discourse. This too is usually missing from the discussions. And yet, as qualitative researchers on conflict would tell you, as most emphasize, and as anyone who follows politics will know, Brexit is just one obvious example, language and the explanations and excuses that we make matter deeply to patterns of mobilization, identification, and conflict. There's lots that one might say on this, but let me just illustrate one issue that I'm particularly concerned about by bringing up somebody that I first came across when I was an undergraduate student. This is Jean-François Lyotard, author of the famous book, The Postmodern Condition, which was like a manifesto for what postmodernism should be taken to mean. And what he famously declared is that he understood postmodernity as involving incredulity towards meta-narratives, disbelief, skepticism about meta-narratives, big stories. And the meta-narratives he was particularly concerned about were progressivist ones. He emphasized that in the name of the emancipation of the working classes, state communalism had done the most incredible violence. One might emphasize in the same way that in the name of bringing civilization to the planet, European powers had done incredible violence to the non-European world. And by extension, though we are still a long way from this, I do worry about the violence that is going to be done, ultimately, in the name of saving the planet. What greater reason could there be for the actions that are taken in the name of that very important cause can potentially have very profound, serious consequences? That's an overall and very schematic framework for you. There's much more that can be said about this model, especially about the likely interactions between the dimensions, about interactions with other factors, about their relative importance, about the potential for more positive things, especially peace building and cooperation. Maybe we can turn to some of those in discussion. But before doing that, I want to come back to mitigation and say something about this. To start with, to get into the sort of question of mitigation, I want to emphasize the scale of the challenge. Now, this is a piece, this is something from an extract from a recent blog post by Roger Pielka, I don't know how to pronounce his name, an American academic. Let me just read it out for you. Succeeding in the stabilization of carbon dioxide at low levels in the atmosphere will require a massive reduction in the use of fossil fuels. There has been essentially no serious international policy focus on how this might actually be done. Consider that the world consumes more than 11,000 million metric tons of oil equivalent of fossil fuels each year. If this number is approached to zero, then the world would need to retire and replace about 1 million tons each day until 2050, the equivalent of a nuclear power plant's worth of carbon-free energy every day. Actually, one would need to do more than that because that doesn't take into account likely increased energy demands over this period, which is likely to be substantial. How might the world decommission such a magnitude of fossil fuel energy? The current UN policy envelope has been an exercise, he says, in avoiding this question. What would it mean to get serious about answering it? Now, let me unpack this a little bit. Let me first unpack the claim here highlighted in red at the top. To start with, it's worth noting that the Paris Agreement and its predecessors do not even mention fossil fuels. Instead, what they talk about is reducing emissions from fossil fuel consumption. Put differently, they adopt a demand-side approach to tackling climate change without any corresponding sort of discussion or mechanisms for stemming fossil fuel production or fossil fuel supply. How within this demand-side framework are emissions to be reduced? Well, essentially there are three processes that are at work in the UN process and in the IPCC scenarios that follow from and also inform them. Firstly, what is called spontaneous decarbonisation. That is, through technological and economic changes which are imagined to occur without any policy action, which will happen anyway, automatically, through economic and technological development. Now, many of the IPCC scenarios assume that as much as 2/3 of the decarbonisation needed will happen through such spontaneous means. Secondly, the second way in which these emissions reductions are going to be achieved, and this is increasingly in the more recent scenarios, through negatives emissions technologies. especially what is called, most importantly, what is called BECCS, the acronym BECCS, which is bioenergy, production of bioenergy, which then is used to generate power, and there is carbon capture and storage of that of the carbon released when that bioenergy material is burned and it's stored underground. And then thirdly, the third mechanism is pricing, the use of price mechanisms, whether subsidies, taxes, offsetting, or whatever, to promote the use of renewables and to reduce fossil fuel consumption. Now, this is essentially how the IPC scenarios and the UN policy framework imagine we're going to get there, that mitigation will be achieved. Now, unfortunately, I think much of this is science fiction. Negative emissions technologies are very clearly that. They do not yet exist at any scale, and they are deeply impractical at that. Just to give one recent illustration. One analysis has shown that full implementation of BECCS, that's the bioenergy technique, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, at the scale imagined by some scenarios, would require a land area, not just the size of India, but 1.5 times the size of India, to be put aside for bioenergy production, biofuels production. Equally, the idea that pricing mechanisms are the only policy intervention that's needed to ensure a transition away from fossil fuels is, in my view, misplaced economism. To consider why, I think it's worth turning to a fantastic book by Andreas Malm called Fossil Capital, which is actually a study of the rise of the fossil fuel economy in early industrial Britain. Now, what Malm shows in this book, it's a long book, but it's very nice read. I very strongly recommend it to you. What he shows is that the transition away from water to coal, because the earliest bit of the Industrial Revolution in Britain was powered by water, not coal. This transition from water to coal happened not because of scarcity. There wasn't a scarcity of water supply. And it also wasn't because of price. Actually, using water was a lot cheaper for Britain's early capitalists. It happened because coal empowered mill owners over and against their workers. Coal was easier to use as a way of sort of managing the demands of the workforce. Coal in the early Industrial Revolution came to dominate Britain's early Industrial Revolution because it was an instrument of power, specifically in that case, class power. Now, by the same token, in thinking about the coming energy transition, I think we need to recognize that oil, coal, and gas are not just sources of energy, but sources of economic and political power. Solar powers and wind turbines, yes, they're going to become cheaper, but they'll never offer the same money-making or power-wielding advantages to major corporations or major producer states. And to put it bluntly, neither Shell nor the Russian state is going to stop producing oil and gas simply because renewables get cheaper. Let me come at this a slightly different way. Both the IPCC and the current global policy framework portray the trade-offs between cutting carbon emissions and other sort of societal goals as relatively minor. This is a graph from the IPCC's 1.5 degrees C report of last year. And this is their assessment of the potential synergies and trade-offs between reducing carbon emissions to meet 1.5 degrees C and all the other sustainable development goals. Now, you don't need to look at the detail of this, but what it shows, what you'll see here in this graphic is the blue lines are the synergies and the brown lines are the trade-offs. Okay, thank you. And what they're basically saying here is that they think that the trade-offs aren't that great. There are much greater trade-offs between reducing climate, decarbonizing, and other agendas. Now, personally, I think this is an article of faith. This, for instance, is what they say, the IPC says on the potential trade-offs in relation to oil and gas producer states. Mitigation consistent with 1.5 degrees C pathways creates risk for sustainability development in regions of high dependency on fossil fuels for revenue and employment generation, but that policies that promote diversification can help to address these challenges. Now, the first bit of the sentence is correct. The first sentence is correct. The second, it seems to me, is incredibly well, understates the scale of the challenge. My time is sort of coming to a close, and I'm a little bit short of time. But I'm going to try and crack on. I want to come to this issue in a third way as well. This is a well-known analysis by Christopher McGlade and Paul Eakins on the oil, gas, and coal that will need to remain unused if we're to stay within 2 degrees C. And what they conclude in their analysis is that a third of oil reserves, it's highlighted down here, half of gas reserves, and over 80% of coal reserves need to be considered unburnable. Now, this is a serious and quite simple finding, and yet there has been hardly any serious international policy analysis or discussion on how these fossil fuels are going to be kept in the ground. Very little serious thinking about it. Now, this is all by way of context setting for understanding the conflict and security implications of mitigation. My view from this is that there are huge conflict and security implications from mitigation, and sort of starting to wrap this up, I want simply to list what I take to be the major potential axes of these. Firstly, it seems to me clear that as the costs of mitigation ramp up, as they inevitably will, there are going to be increasing conflicts over who bears these costs and over how the costs are distributed. If you like, the Gilets jaunes might be seen as an early window on this. Secondly, low and even middle-income fossil fuel producer states, where fossil fuels are absolutely key to their state budgets and national economies and to regime stability, what political scientists would call rentier states, are going to face enormous challenges as the world decarbonises. This graph gives you an indication of, this is from World Bank data, fuel exports as a percentage of merchandise exports for the most fuel exporter-dependent economies. These are the type of countries which are going to face huge problems as the world decarbonises. I would envisage in many such states, a combination of regime fiscal crises and collapses, social conflicts and protests and revolts over access to ever-dwindling fossil fuel rents, mass migration from fossil fuel producer countries, and changing regional power balances. Of course, quite how this plays out depends upon the report they receive, but it's going to be significant. Third, I think there are going to be growing conflicts between what one might call environmental defender movements and organizations and various incumbent state and corporate interests. For reasons of time, I won't go into a lot of detail on this. We can pick that up in discussion. Fourth, I think we need to take the great powers seriously as well, because they're going to be a huge problem. Here, by the great powers, in this context, I mean the US, China, and Russia. For these three are not only the world's leading military powers, they're also the three leading producers of fossil fuels. And in all three cases, fossil fuel exploitation is absolutely central to their geopolitical ambitions and strategies. The US is now the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. and its national security strategy under Trump is now committed to a strategy of attaining what it calls energy dominance. Russia, as this audience will know well, has not just a record of using oil and gas for geopolitical power projection, but is also essentially a rentier state. So it's doubly worrying. And as for China, while it isn't an important exporter, domestic coal production and its use for Chinese industry are crucial to Chinese economic strategy. For me, it is very hard to imagine that any of these states will willingly consent to keeping their energy assets stranded in the ground when these assets are so central to their place in the world and their geopolitical ambitions. Quite what the implications of that is, I will again put aside for reasons of time, but that we could come to. Fifth, it seems to me that assuming there is at some point I passed over this, but assuming there is at some point a multilateral agreement on how to keep oil, gas and coal in the ground, which I think at some point they will need to be, there will have to be some framework for addressing those supply side issues at some point. This will have to be monitored, regulated and policed. Goodness knows how that will be done, but it will be far from straightforward. There are questions of conflict around mitigation technologies. I've indicated some of this in relation to BECCS already, an area 1.5 times the size of India to be put aside for bioenergy production. Imagine what the social and in turn conflict consequences of that could be. And lastly, there are questions to be asked about renewables, especially if some of our renewable strategies, let's say, depend heavily upon solar, where there's a high dependence on lithium or on other important heavy metals. I won't go further into that because I'm sure you're depressed enough already. Let me close by trying to say something briefly about the policy and practical implications of my remarks. Now, the overall implication of what I've said is that climate change presages, portends a global social crisis and is going to have conflict on many, many, many levels, and that it is a mistake, and indeed I would call it an act of imaginative displacement, to think that conflict will only happen in the black or brown corners of the earth. I think there's a particular imaginative geography at work in a lot of mainstream climate security thinking that says that the conflict implications are going to happen over there and not over here, or that we're not directly implicated in them. Let me try and offer 3 more precise recommendations, though. Firstly, I'd advise policymakers, the media and analysts to steer clear of sensationalist and apocalyptic claims about climate change impacts. Most of them are exaggerated. Some have no foundation at all. I'm not talking about stuff on the natural side, but on the science side, and I'm not even talking about potential implications at a humanitarian level, as hopefully I indicated very early on. I'm talking about how that might feed through into societal, civilizational collapse and so on. Such claims may make you feel better or help convey the impression of how seriously you take climate change. But in my view, they achieve little. They're often an excuse for action, just as ambitious targets are often an excuse for action. And they also, unfortunately, often provide fertile material for climate denialism. Anyone who has scoured the climate denialist web, you'll find lots of pretty good deconstructions, a lot of the exaggerated claims made about climate change. And I bear that in mind in relation to making them. That's the first thing. I'd advise caution. Secondly, I think policymakers need to start thinking about conflict-sensitive adaptation, and more broadly about the dangers of maladaptation. In my experience, policymakers dealing with adaptation issues view it as so urgent that the usual rules of development work, like making sure it's done in a conflict-sensitive way or a gender-sensitive way, they're basically not fully applied, not properly applied or thought about, because adaptation is seen as so urgent. I think that's dangerous. And then thirdly, and above all, I think the global policy community needs to start taking the challenge of mitigation as a political challenge much more seriously. In particular, it needs to start thinking about how fossil fuels are going to be kept in the ground. Much more action is clearly needed to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. Some action is starting to take place on that. Much more is needed. Northern states need to start talking with poor fossil fuel producer states about how they're going to put their oil, coal, and gas beyond use. And I think that also principles for a global mitigation policy framework need to start being developed. There is plenty of space, I think, for Finland to do something different in this area in a way that doesn't necessarily follow what Sweden is doing. In fact, I'd recommend a departure from the model that they have followed. And hopefully Finland, including in its domestic mitigation, can lead the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for UPI for organizing this meeting and discussion. And thank you, Professor Selby, for a very, very interesting and indeed thought-provoking presentation. As you were proceeding, I was going through my notes, and I indeed present the policy part in which we are very much in the thinking that there is a link between climate change and the increased likelihood of conflicts. Nevertheless, I think it was very interesting, the points that you made, and if I understood it correctly, you didn't deny this link, but you were warning us for exaggerating this link. And I hope that we will have time for this discussion as well. But let me point out few things from the policy perspective. And indeed, I work in conflict prevention and mediation related issues at the Foreign Ministry, so that is where I come from. And that's how I will comment or use my 5 minutes today. It is our understanding that there is plenty of research showing that the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on food security, ecosystems, livelihoods, water supply, and key economic sectors like agriculture exists. And we see that climate change is a threat multiplier. I realize that there's the policy jargon Emma was referring to in her opening remarks. It's a multiplier for conflicts over access to increasingly scarce resources and for instability as well as international and internal displacement. This is particularly the case in vulnerable or fragile countries and regions lacking the necessary capacity for building resilience and coping with disasters. Conflicts over natural resources such as water are often part of the root causes that create instability. And from conflict prevention perspective, addressing these issues is crucial, including in mediation and dialogue processes. As a representative of the Finnish government, I have to underline that, as with all conflict prevention, taking an inclusive approach to finding solutions is a key. And in this context, women are often among the first ones to suffer from climate change-related risks. And we also know women's contribution to peaceful solutions that sustain is decisive. Including youth in peace processes, conflict prevention and mediation efforts is equally important. The contribution of youth is especially meaningful in responding to climate change, as young men and women have an obvious interest in making sure there is a future for this planet. We have seen strong examples of young people taking a lead on climate, and we should do more to support this leadership and raise the level of engagement further. I will say a few words about the UN and the European Union, as they are, of course, key fora for Finland in foreign policy field. The UN recognizes very strongly the links between security and peace and climate change and environment. Security Council, for example, has discussed about the climate change first time already in 2007, and there has been discussions regularly ever since. And for example, climate risk analysis is something that has been discussed when the Security Council discusses about mandates of the operations, for example. In last October, DPPA, that is the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, UNDP, the UN Development Programme, and UNEP, UN Environmental Programme, launched the Climate and Security Mechanism, which aims at intensifying UN's actions through cooperation by supporting integrated analysis. On the EU side, climate policy of the European Union is integrated into the EU's common foreign and security policy, so it's an integral part of EU's external relations. Council has adopted conclusions on climate diplomacy in February 2018, and this was the first time when the security aspect of the climate change was addressed in the EU. Council conclusions on water diplomacy were adopted last November, and in the conclusions the Council, for example, stresses the essential link between water and climate change and welcomes the discussions at the UN Security Council linking water, climate, peace and security. The conclusions confirm EU's and its member states' continued commitment to address water challenges around the world and to give the necessary consideration to the importance of water and sanitation in the programming of future financial and technical cooperation with partner countries. Needless to say, the European Union and its member states support with a wide range of programs measures to strengthen resilience in an integrated manner in different regions of the world. How about Finland then? As was referred earlier, Prime Minister Antti Rinne's government was appointed a few weeks ago, and the government program Inclusive and Competent Finland, a socially, economically and ecologically sustainable society was adopted on 6th of June. Program's ambition level is very high regarding the actions against climate change. In the globally influential Finland part of the program, the current situation is described like this, and I quote, "Awareness of problems affecting the entire globe is increasing. Extensive, broad-based cooperation and swift measures are needed to address issues with the most far-reaching impacts, such as climate change, demographic trends, reduction of the loss of biological diversity, and preservation of viable environment. The Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda, which lays down the Sustainable Development Goals, provide the foundation for international cooperation and Finland's actions in the coming years. The government program also emphasizes and aims to strengthen the role of conflict prevention, mediation and peace building. And personally, I think that this program will give the Foreign Ministry a strong mandate to work on these issues we are talking here today. Then just a few examples from the practical side Finland is doing. We have, for example, highlighted the importance of hydrometeorological cooperation and facilitated intensified collaboration between the World Meteorological Organization and national hydrometeorological institutes around the globe. Our development aid in the field of meteorology is the second highest in the world. Improved capacity to produce high-quality weather and climate information will help countries to respond to the increased climate-related risks, and in addition help sectors such as agriculture to better adapt to the impacts of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by saying a few words about the water diplomacy as one of Finland's recognized strength areas in conflict prevention and mediation. Climate change, as has been discussed, affects all of us mainly through changes in hydrological cycles, such as floods, droughts, and by adding water scarcity. Water and other natural resources have often central geopolitical role in relations between states, openly or in the background. As water scarcity increases, water, food and energy safety can become a threat to national security. In these kinds of situations, shared water resources can lay firstly foundation for conflict prevention activities, including mediation, and secondly for regional cooperation, especially if their shared political, economical and societal benefits are recognized. And this is important. This is why water should not be seen only as a conflict cause, but also and foremost as an enabler for cooperation. And this is also something that I would like to have you as a takeaway from this discussion. By committed and targeted action of different actors, states, civil society, academia, and so on, at international, regional, national, and local level, we can reduce the risk of climate change, climate-related disasters, and ensure that their impacts can be better handled. In achieving this, we would remove a significant risk for peace and security in many parts of the world. And that is why I really welcome, Emma, what you were saying in the beginning about cross-sectoral approach and networking and coordination. I think this is really something that we will need to continue. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Emma, and thank you for the invitation. And also, I was very curiously listening to Professor Selby, because many of the points that I had written down on my statement previously were sort of challenged by the presentation, so I will now try to adapt to what I heard. First of all, I fully agree on the global social conflict. So we are especially, it's not a problem on the global south, but it's a problem that we are all facing. And as you were mentioning, we can't know the exact consequences of what will happen. It's very difficult to determine what will be the future, but what we know already are the early warning signs, that we can take a look at those and make an analysis based on those, what might be the future. Sustainable development goals as a global agenda, I think, is one very useful exercise for us already to see how we can actually act in the way of leaving no one behind, as is the global slogan. I think one important example to look at in the near neighborhood of Finland is Norway, actually, because that's one of the key countries that you were also having in your list of countries that is very much depending on oil as a promoter of its wealth. And how will the position of Norway change, for example, when we look at who are the global development funders? Because Norway is one of the only countries that has actually reached the objective of 1% of its GNI to be projected for global development. So how will that position change? I think it's important to think about that. Because then, on the other hand, in the top of the list, you have also Iraq, which is a very wealthy country when you look at the resources that they have, but at the same time, it's a conflict-prone country. It's a country in conflict, which has also severe implications. What will happen if climate change actually hits the region of Middle East? So these are very important questions. Considering where I come from is the development cooperation civil society perspective. Fingo represents almost 300 Finnish civil society organizations that are working on different topics on development in all over the world. And how we see this discussion is actually because security policy is, of course, what we are traditionally thinking about as global threats related to the army and military. But what I was very happy to see is that development policy is part of the security policy. And in the new government program of Finland also, there is a human rights-based approach on the whole security and foreign policy, which is something that we haven't really seen before. What we are now curious to see as civil society is how these human rights will actually be taken into account. Because when we look at exactly as you were pointing out, Professor Selby, the mitigation measures, how they will be taken into account now that the situation is changing and we are seeing more and more of the global panic rising, and even our the government program in Finland is now centralized. It is centralized on sustainable development, but at the same time there is a strong emphasis on climate change. And what we are concerned about as civil society is what will be these mitigation measures? How will they impact, for example, the indigenous peoples? We already see the effect in Latin America, for example. You have environmental defenders that are getting killed because they are protecting the forests, or they are trying to protect their traditional ways of earning their living, or they are trying to protect their culture. And the global companies are coming, and the state is actually coming, and the police is the one who they can't trust as defender of their rights, but they have to actually escape from the police. They have to escape from the army. So this is another dimension that is coming into this discussion. It is exactly a question about governance as well. How are we going to, what kind of mitigation measures are we going to plan so that they actually don't leave anyone behind? And I think one of the answers to that is actually the Sustainable Development Goal number 17, which is the partnerships part. But again, there is a question of how do we define partnerships? Because now, for example, the Finnish government is channeling more and more of its development funding towards the new partners, which means private sector. We don't have anything against private sector taking part in the common goal of making the world a better place, but what are the rules? How are they doing it? And how do we make sure that we have an adequate way of seeing that that funding is transparent, that is actually being channeled to those who need the funding the most? Because what we see in data by the World Bank, for example, is that conflicts and poverty, they do go together. I agree with Professor Selby that climate change, there is no clear consequence so far based on the data that we have, but we do have data about conflicts and poverty getting into the same countries. Personally, I spent 2.5 years in Afghanistan, which is one of the most severely damaged countries in the world, thinking that the poverty is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's also a very conflict-prone country. There's prolonged conflict of 40 years. And it's also in the heart of geopolitics, which is one of the key reasons why it is in conflict. And that's why I was very happy to hear that you pointed out also the US, Russia, and China relations there, because in a way, in foreign policy, we've gone back to where we were a few decades ago, looking at the geopolitical structures, and these big players are there again. And they are not only there in Afghanistan, they are there in Africa as well, which is now one of the key areas where the EU and Finland are looking at. And I think we should be looking at Africa also in terms of climate change. So where I'm coming to as a conclusion, because I don't have a lot of time, is actually what Professor Selby didn't mention straightforward is inequality. And I think that's the key question that we're facing. For example, UNDP this year is making the Human Development Report on inequality. There is the EU is planning to look at inequality as how do we actually mitigate the fact that inequality is growing even inside the European Union. And this is the key question. It's not about the climate change, but it's about how do we make sure that we all have equal access to those resources, that the governance is done in such a way that even those who are most affected by climate change. It's true what you were saying, that actually everybody in a country such as Brazil is affected by climate change, but there are differences of whether the elite has the funding to actually mitigate and protect themselves. Like we in Finland, we have the funds to protect ourselves. But a Brazilian farmer who is living in the indigenous community probably doesn't have those chances. So I think this is the key question that we should be facing.
Thank you very much. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and thank you very much, Professor Selby, for the thought-provoking, interesting presentation, and presenting, let's say, inconvenient viewpoints that challenge the thinking. That's I think very important. I would also bring up that it's very important when we're talking about climate, environmental security, climate security, is to talk about scales. And time scales of different threats. So in that sense, I think it's important not to make too much of, like as you were talking, like too much of conclusions about the issues today or things perceived as climate conflicts today and let's say the big picture. Challenging the narratives is also important. I think we're, in terms of environmental security, climate change, we're fallen a bit often in like simplified dichotomies of good and bad, or victims and culprits, or harmony and chaos and stuff like that. Whereas, in fact, we're facing a complicated global challenge, which, from my point of view, stems from an ultimate dilemma that we have created immense wealth and well-being, although very unevenly distributed at the moment, and we're striving to continue this development, this human development in the future. But this is run on a model of energy and land use that can't be sustainable in long or even in the medium term, since it's fueled by by fossil fuels, and it's based on kind of increasing the impact on land and sea use of humans in general. So this kind of runs us into risk of or hits limits at some points, with the risk of major collapses of different ecosystem services or a completely different state of climate, maybe face through some tipping points of something. So this is something that I guess the good point is that you cannot scale from one conflict in a poor country into this actual, the big picture we're talking about here. I'll shorten a bit, since I think this is a good basis for a conversation as well. The challenge with fossil fuels, I guess, I would just add to what you were saying, is not that they're not just an issue of power distribution in the society. They're also a very, very, very good sources of energy in terms of energy density and mobility. And transforming or the transition from these types of energy economy to a non-emitting one, or sustainable one, is technically a big challenge as well, and makes us question that what can we how much of what are the limits, material limits of our society. And I'd end with regarding to your 7 dimensions. I would think about, when you mentioned Waltz asking like who is likely to be around. I think the question now is what is likely to be around, in terms of we know ultimately I'd say thermodynamics guide our policy making. So we know that we're facing a global challenge of fitting our like wants and needs in a finite planet, and how we face that. And I think that's the key question. Then what type of scenarios can we build in with these types of boundaries, and then we should project our policies, and how do we get to the ends that we want to get into. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, there's quite a lot which has been already said, so I'll just try to summarize 3 kind of larger topics that would be good to be discussed a little bit more. One is that, which was mentioned, is that climate change is basically about the redistribution of water, and we know quite a lot how that will happen. For example, we know that the glaciers in Himalaya, for example, are melting, and because of the climate change. Then we know that the temperature, the mentioned wet bulb temperature, is going to be really problem in India in near future. But for example, just during the last 3 weeks, India has been going on through heat wave, and now they are running out of the water. So these things are actually happening. They are systemic effects and changes that are taking effect now, and we've known those for a long time, but they are really hard to actually somehow take into account given the current infrastructure and societal system. Same with food, that we know how the food production might change. We know that there might be better climate conditions up north when the climate changes, but then again, soil doesn't move. So we have to reconsider what to actually cultivate, how the topsoil actually is affected because of the climate change. And that is something that is not so easy to solve, because most of the best places to cultivate by taking the soil actually are now already used. So that is one kind of like thing to consider. Then the other is the transformation towards sustainability. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is international commerce, which is actually heavily dependent on use of fossil fuels, and how that will actually change in future. That hasn't been really, and how much that, for example, affects European Union or Finland, which are quite open economies. And then, and all the structural changes that are necessary because of those changes. And then the third thing, which hasn't been mentioned yet, I think, is that although Arctic was mentioned, we now know that the Arctic has actually leaving the kind of 20th century baseline or the trajectory. So we are really on uncharted territory. So we really don't know what is going to happen for the climate, ecosystem, and so on. So there will be surprises there, and that will increase the kind of geopolitical tensions there. And then there's the kind of like interplay between conservation, sustainability, and resource grabbing there. So those are kind of like 3 points that would be good to be kept in mind when discussing. So those are my discussion points.